Well, Riot was kind enough to give us not only card reveals today, but also patch notes today. These are the patch notes for 0.9.4, and this is likely the last patch that we're going to get before the full release, before our first expansion. And there are a number of card changes here, and even though the dev notes list card changes and then down below they list some additional things for clarity reasons, the clarity cleanup stuff actually has some pretty significant card changes in them as well. So I'm going to cover those. Now, in the dev notes, they do start kind of talking about their cadence for card changes and where they want things to be and how they think that they are, relatively okay with where things are at. They also talk about expeditions tuning and what they want to do with those. As always, this video will have a link to the actual patch notes in the video description, so if you do want to read through these, and I do recommend it, you can click on the link to get there. But we're going to just go to the updates because that's what folks care about. So, Draven is getting a buff, and that is a bit of a shock to me because the Ezreal Draven list has been incredibly, I'm not going to say like dominant, but represented lately. It's a powerful deck list. It's showing up in many tournament winning lineups, and essentially the change is that before Draven had to strike twice while wielding a spinning axe, and now he levels up when he has struck with 2 total spinning axes. So what that means is that before it didn't matter if you equipped him with 1 spinning axe or 10 spinning axes, that counted as 1 strike. Now, if you double spinning axe him in a single turn, right? So you put 2 axes on him and then he strikes a single unit or strikes the nexus, those 2 axes then count and he levels up. So he's just now easier to level up, gets a bit of a buff as a result. Nothing else changes with the card. Now, on the one hand, I like this change because it makes it, I think, just a little more intuitive. The very first time that I had ever played Draven, I thought it worked this way. I learned the hard way that it did not. Now it does work this way, so I think that this makes sense. It's just, a little surprising to me. If you would have said like, hey, Draven's getting a buff prior to the patch notes, I would have kind of chuckled. Katarina is the next card that was adjusted, and she also gets a bit of a buff, and I fully understand this. Essentially, her level 1 version has a new on-play effect, and that creates a fleeting Blade's Edge in hand. And they talk about the idea of, Katarina has this problem where if you play her early on in your curve or early on in a game, you oftentimes fall behind because you play her, you get the 1 attack with her, but then because she bounces back into your hand, you kind of fall behind on board state, right? If you develop and your opponent develops and Katarina bounces back to your hand and through combat she does not trade with another unit, and very often that's the case because why would you just jump a unit in front of her? Then you fall behind, right? You're sacrificing board state for dealing some extra damage to your opponent, but at that stage in the game it's really not worth the trade-off. So now the idea is that you play her and you get this fleeting Blade's Edge, which is the 1 cost, deal 1 damage to any target card, and you can use that for either additional damage to the Nexus or to, hopefully get rid of a 1 health unit to offset her going back to your hand, right? The idea is that, yeah, it's just 1 damage, but you can, use it to hopefully slow down their board state, even if it's something small, just a little bit to offset the negative of playing her early. So I like this change. Yasuo also got a bit of a buff. He gets +1 health at level 1 and at level 2. So goes from a 4-3 to being a 4-4, and then level 2 is now a 5-5. And I believe this change was actually leaked a while ago. On Twitter, there was a build for the mobile client that had, a splash screen when you logged in that said, hey, here are changes that are coming. Then they took screenshots of it, and it was a bit of a mistake for it to have went out early. So this is not a shock to me. This is something I expected, and it does make sense. A 4-drop that still died to a number of different removal options, and specifically a 4-drop that was your build around card, felt a little rough. I'm not sure whether or not this makes Yasuo, amazing, but I've already seen a bit of a rise in his play rate, and I suspect that if mid-range becomes more popular with this next expansion, and I think that they are trying to kind of push mid-range a little bit, Yasuo could rise in popularity. Yasuo is the kind of like tempo pseudo control deck that I think does best against mid-range lists, where you're playing things on curve, playing more expensive units, so that you can take advantage of the stuns and take advantage of the recalls because you get more value. Paying 4 for a Will of Ionia on a 1 or a 2 drop isn't really that helpful, but doing it against a 4, a 5, a 6 drop can be a really big tempo swing. Those are where you want to be utilizing your Yasuo toolset cards. Again, I think that we'll see if this ends up being enough. I do like this change, keeping your build around cards alive enough to feel that satisfaction of getting the opportunity to do something with them is important. Like, the last thing you want is you play your Yasuo and then before you ever get to bounce anything, stun in anything, recall anything, it gets hit with get excited. It just feels bad. So I do like this change. Kalista gets a buff, and they talk about how they saw her play rate skyrocket, but her power level still wasn't quite where they wanted it. And so this change is now, instead of 4 or more allies dying, she needs to see 3 or more allies die. This might not seem like that big of a change, but it's massive. This really makes me want to revisit deck building with Kalista, because now Kalista in a single haunted relic is enough to level her up. That is huge. So now she is more resilient in the early game. She has a relevant keyword and is going to be that much easier to get that trigger. A single haunted relic will level her up. Brood has been very popular as far as creating 3 spiders, and now a single brood, once those spiders die, will also level her up. This is, I think, a really important change and is going to make Kalista a lot more viable as a result. Do not sleep on this. This is a big deal. All right, followers and spells. Laurent Dualist is changing from a 3/2 to a 4/2. And they kind of talk about how they want the challenger keyword to allow you to kind of push damage or kind of punish your opponent. They mentioned specifically the phrase profitable attacks. So I think the idea here was they want you to play Laurent Dualist and then have, your 1 or 2 drop that you played the turn before challenge their best blocker, and then this gets through for that additional 4 damage. In the right deck, I can actually see this being, relatively good or pretty relevant. Specifically, if you consider pairing like Demacia with P&Z, right? Piltover and Zon. If you have a turn 2 Boom Crew that has, a resilient health total, that 1/4 body, and you give that challenger and it challenges a blocker and it's likely going to survive at that point, but you also push through this 4 damage, that's a lot of damage that you can push through. So we'll see. This has not been a very popular tool as of late. I think this also has a really big impact in expeditions, so I would look for it there as well. Demacia is already, the favorite region of choice when it comes to expeditions, so I think it certainly matters there. Vanguardmen. This is another one of the changes that was leaked, and I'm not shocked by this. Essentially, the text on it is changing from grant all allies +1/+1 when its allegiance triggers to instead say grant other allies +1/+1. In other words, this was a very safe play before, even on an empty board, because you would very often still get a 4/4 for 4, and any additional stats that it was granting were just kind of bonus stats. Now you kind of have to lean into playing this onto an existing board to really get the benefit. So your real, cost to value ratio starts when you've got like 2 other bodies on the board. And at that point, if you're getting a 5/5 for 4, you're still pretty happy, but playing this on an empty board is no longer, a great play or even just a mediocre play. So this makes sense. I'm not surprised to see this change. Blood for Blood. This card is getting a cost reduction. It's going from a 3 cost to a 2 cost, and I'm I'm actually kind of interested to see how this works out. I know that the standard for card draw in this game has been, and probably will be for a long time, Glimpse, right? That's naturally what this card is going to be compared to. Glimpse, you kill off a unit and you draw 2 cards, but when this goes down to a 2 cost, and so it's at the exact same cost as Glimpse, you're now in a situation where you don't necessarily draw 2 cards, but you also don't have to kill off your unit. And specifically knowing exactly what unit you're going to be drawing, right? I say that with quotes because you're creating a copy in your hand. That also is pretty relevant. And I really like this card on things with toughness. So Noxus does not often get played with Demacia, but the idea of playing something like, you know, Radiant Guardian and then doing 0 damage to it because of its toughness and making more copies of Radiant Guardian is rather enticing, and it's certainly a lot more enticing at 2 mana as opposed to 3. Playing this card on something like Curator is also, I think, really enticing at 2 mana. I think this is a good change. I think that you might see more folks experiment with the card as a result. It's still not going to be on the same power level as Glimpse because Glimpse does so many other things in terms of activating what you want out of Shadow Isles, but for, you know, Scars decks and things of the like, I think this is a good move. I like the support here with Blood for Blood. Alright, so next up is a change to Cato the Arm. Cato is going from a 5-3 to a 5-4, and that is, you know, potentially pretty relevant. They talk about how in many aggressive Noxus decks, it's usually not worth your time to play the more expensive units on curve because the risk is not worth the reward. But taking this unit out of the 3 health position is a pretty big deal. When you have 4 health, you're almost indestructible in this game. Now, obviously, those units can still die. But what I mean is that 3 is like the magic point where there are still a number of relevant effects that can kill you. And once you go above that, the number of cards that can kill you individually goes down significantly. So you go out of Get Excited range, you go out of Grasp the Undying range, you go out of Black Spear range. There's just a number of cards that deal 3 and not many cards that deal 4. And that is ever so important. So I think this change is good. I like this card. The fact that what's interesting about this card is the fact that it swings for 5, and then it's also giving +3/+0 and Overwhelm to whatever it supports. So it creates a situation where you really don't want to block either one of them. And at 4 health, there's going to be far more things that you are using to block it that will kill it right away. So at 3 health, another thing to consider is there's just a number of units that have exactly 3 attack that are being played because you need that 3 attack to start blocking fearsome units. And honestly, there's just a lot of popular 3 attack units, whether it's the 3/2s that are 2 drops, whether it's things like Skitterer, etc., etc. So going from 3 health to 4 health means you're less likely to have Cato get blocked and immediately die. And so again, you're kind of creating this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation with Cato. I like this change. If they're trying to bump up his play rate, this is enough to at least let me consider running him. So I like it. All right, Everosin Trapper. This is getting, in my opinion, a pretty significant buff. This is going to go from a 2/2 to a 3/3. Now, if you're not familiar with this card, this is the one that shuffles in an Enraged Yeti, which is the 1 cost 5/5, and it shuffles it into the top 3 cards of your deck. This card, I didn't even want to run this in Expeditions before, but a 3/3 for 3 that does this, I am now happy to run it in Expeditions, and I would even consider running this in potentially certain constructed decks. This is a pretty sizable buff for a number of reasons. The health, again, not premium health. 4 is the magic number, but going from 2 to 3 is a big deal because it takes you out of that Mystic Shot range and it takes you out of a number of other cards that would kill you automatically. And the power, again, the attack power going from 2 to 3, magic number because you want to be able to block fearsome units. This is interesting. I I don't know if it's good enough to make the cut. The only reason that I'm even considering it is because with the Freljord reveals, it looked like they were trying to give Freljord a more proactive deck style, or some more proactive options. They want to support that play style. They don't want Freljord to just be control. And I think that this change is another step in that direction. The idea of, you know, you're going to play these units, and then you might also get some cost-effective units as a result, specifically that, you know, one cost 5/5, and then if you've got a number of ways to give cards like that overwhelm, I think that that is, you know, what they want Freljord to be, just beefy units that you overpower people with. Speaking of beefy units, Starlit Seer is getting a buff as well, going from a 2/2 to a 2/3, and this is, again, very enticing. I have almost never considered running this card because the stat line was not great, but making it a 2/3, I actually might consider running this in certain Freljord lists. I think that, you know, you run enough spells in Freljord when you are running the Frostbite options that, you know, even if you get 1 or 2 triggers from this, you're going to start getting the value out of it. I think there's some room here. I really like this for expeditions. I think that this is going to be far more enticing in expeditions as well. All right, next up for changes, we have Weirding Stones. Goes from a 0/3 to a 0/4, and again, going from 3 health to 4 health is a bit of a magic number. This matters, in my opinion, far more for blocking, because you want to play the Weirding Stones. Let's be honest, like, nobody's going to waste premium removal on Weirding Stones unless they're just trying to avoid, you know, overdrawing a card. They got 10 cards in their hand. Well, I guess I'll use Grasp of the Undying. So I don't think this is very relevant in that regard, but I do think that this is relevant for blocking reasons. So you can now block some of those 3 attack units and then still survive. I think that, again, this is fine for now. I don't see any reason to really dislike this. We'll wait and see after the expansion, but for right now, I think this is fine. All right, Shady Character gets a bit of a buff. It goes from a 1/1 to a 1/3, and I'm fine with this as well for exactly the reasons that they are mentioning. It was too easy to disrupt this card with damage in response. Now, if you're not familiar, what happens is you play this card, and then you pick a follower, and it puts a skill on the stack to become an exact copy of it. But while that skill is on the stack, you could still nuke this to prevent the transformation. And at a 1/1, that meant, like, you'd spend 4 to copy something, you know, amazing, and then they would hit this with Vile Feast. They would hit this with Mystic Shot. They'd hit this with Blade's Edge, whatever. And then this would just die, and it wouldn't copy something. At 3 health, you can still disrupt it with things like Get Excited, with things like Grasp, but it makes it a bit more difficult. So overall, I think this is fine for the card. I like this change. This might, depending on whether or not it gets outright abused in the future, I could see this coming down to 2 health, but for now, I think it's entirely fine. The last card in their official changes, again, there are some more that they have kind of updated for clarity reasons, but the last card in their official changes is Frenzied Skitter Err. This is another one of the leaked changes, and Skitter Err is going from a 3/3 to a 3/2. The summoned effects stay the same, so it's still buffing spiders, still debuffing enemies. It's just a 3/2 now. I think this card is still going to see a ton of play. It just means that it doesn't, you know, block as favorably anymore, specifically with other, you know, 3 attack units. I think that the big deal was on round 3 specifically, if you're playing against an aggressive opponent and they played, like, you know, a 3/2 or a 3/3 before they attacked, and then you played Frenzied Skitter Err, you would basically just shut them out of attacking because you could block with your Skitter Err and get a value trade, and they didn't want to walk into it. Now at 3/2, you know, if they have something that has 3 attack, you play Skitter Err. Yeah, it goes down to 2 attack, but now it still trades with Skitter Err, right? You don't get that value trade on top of the massive debuff that you got. So I like this change. I think this card still sees a ton of play, though. I don't think this affects its play rate. It just kind of lowers the overall impact of the card. And then They mention a watch list, and specifically it's Ezreal and Karma. I am not shocked by either of them being on the watch list because both of them create some amazing plays, but also some disheartening play patterns where if you're playing against an Ezreal deck or you're playing against a Karma deck, and specifically the two of them together, you very often hit a point where you know that you're going to lose and there's nothing you can do about it. And so you keep going through the motions just on the off chance that maybe they just don't have the right cards in their hand. But it can feel really bad to be, you know, playing a game for like 5 or 10 extra minutes, knowing you've likely already lost, and then finding out, yeah, you did in fact lose. It's just the ability, specifically with Ezreal, to win from hand with burst spells where your opponent can't do anything at all to stop you is, I don't know, it's a bit rough. I don't think it creates the interactive play experience that they hope for. He's on the watch list. It would not shock me if at some point in the future, if they do change Ezreal, it would not shock me if they take away his trigger from burst spells and then to compensate maybe increase the damage. Like if they instead say he deals, you know, 3 damage to the enemy nexus for every time you play a fast or a slow spell, or, you know, they give you some sort of like scale. Maybe he deals, you know, 3 for or slow spells, 2 for fast and 1 for burst. But, you know, something to kind of mitigate his ability to kill you while you just sit there and watch. Because that's what happens right now. It's just a billion burst spells and there's nothing you can do about it. That wouldn't shock me. But as for now, Ezreal's on the watch list, Karma's on the watch list. Karma specifically, they just talk about consistency. And now we're going to go through the, again, changes that they say they're making for clarity, but for some of these it actually does have impact on the game. So this first one totally is just clarity. Bright Steel formation. They are, you know, adding the keyword barrier and then saying on player attack, give all allies barrier. And I guess that they were just talking about like redundancies here, because there are times where, you know, multiple barriers don't extra protect you. If you've got 2 barriers, they still only negate 1 source of damage, but it does matter for cards like Shen or cards like Caretaker, and so they are just trying to, I think, mitigate that. So I believe what's happening is that they're removing barrier from this. The card they show still has barrier on it, but then it also has on player attack, give all allies barrier. I believe they are removing barrier and then it's just granting it from the playability, because this was a double trigger before. It has barrier and then it gives itself barrier. I think that's what they're trying to clear up. All right, Swiftwing Lancer. Old text, create an elite in hand. New text, create a random elite in hand. This is specifically something that's supposed to fix how this card works with possession, and they talk about how Lancer would always create an elite when it died under your control if you had elites in those regions, because cards that default cards that create cards default to pulling from within your deck's regions. So again, the idea here is that if you are not playing Demacia and you possess Swiftwing Lancer and then it dies, there were plenty of instances where you would just get no card from that because there are no elites in your region set, and now you will always get an elite when that happens, even if you're not playing a Demacia deck. Farion Assessor is changing from a play effect to a summon effect. So this is actually a buff. Now, the difference is cards that say play only trigger that ability when played from hand. Cards that say when I'm summoned will always trigger it. So if they are revived, if they are created by a random effect, etc., etc. Essentially, it goes from triggering when played from hand to triggering any time it enters the board. And so overall, it's a buff. Whether or not it comes up a lot is yet to be seen, but this is a buff to Farion Assessor. And then the last one that they are making a change to with clarity is actually a pretty big deal. I think this should have been up in the card changes because it's very intricate. So Shark Chariot is changing. It used to say, when an ephemeral ally attacks and I'm dead, return me to play attacking. The new text says, last breath, the next time an ephemeral ally attacks, revive me attacking. Now, at first glance, that might not seem like that big of a deal. However, by making it a last breath ability, there are a number of things that it impacts, and they highlight those. One, if you purify Shark Chariot now, when it dies, it does not come back. So Purify becomes a much better counter for Shark Chariot. Old Shark Chariot, because it just cared whether it was dead or not, there was no way to silence its effect when it was dead. But because the new one is specifically a last breath, you purify it, it dies, the last breath does not trigger as a result. Now, also changing it to a last breath means that Iceborne Legacy will now work better with it because revived copies will gain the buff. But lastly, and this is the other reason that I mentioned this being a pretty big deal, Chariot will now be affected by cards that affect last breath units. So Warden's Prey can create Shark Chariot now, and it could not in the past. And other cards that, you know, may or may not care about last breath, that, you know, even if they don't exist now, might show up in the future. I'm thinking about cards that say, like, you know, trigger the last breath of a, you know, an existing follower or something. This is relevant. This is a big deal. So Shark Chariot now counterable by Purify and can be created by Warden's Prey. This is officially a last breath ability now. And this is a big change. So anyway, that's it for the changes. Again, there are some Expedition archetype changes, and I'm not going to go through every one of these because there's a lot, as you can see, but as always, I will put a link to the patch notes in the video description. And there's a known issue for, you know, the game, and it sometimes crashes. You want to check that out. Some bug fixes as well. Overall, though, I like these patch notes. I think a lot of these are a step in the right direction. I think that these are good changes to see put into play to kind of set a foundation for our upcoming expansion. I think that all of these changes are things that are going to give us a nice, pretty stable state for the game. I think that's what's important. When you're about to introduce a bunch of new cards into the existing pool, you kind of hope that the existing pool is relatively stable. So for some of us, yeah, these card changes aren't necessarily going to change the meta. So if you're one of those folks who thinks things are a bit stale right now, this probably isn't going to do a whole lot to get you brewing again, but I think that's by design. I think they want a nice, stable, kind of even-keeled playing field for things so that when they release the new cards, the existing base set is kind of the control, right? You don't want to introduce new variables to your system if you haven't sorted out the old variables. So for the most part, I like a lot of these changes. I think that these are just kind of evening things out. I didn't see anything that shocked me. And I also think that's probably why Ezreal and Karma ended up on the watch list as opposed to getting the potential reworks that I suspect they might get before the year is over. And that's just because I think they wanted to see whether or not the upcoming expansion impacts them one way or the other. So anyway, if you made it this far, I appreciate you checking out the video. Thanks for watching. You know, if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. Is there anything in here that you saw that says, you know, hey, I do want to build around this, or, you know, this is a bigger deal than you're making it? The one that stands out to me as far as like, I actually kind of want to play around with deck building again is Kalista. Going from 4 allies to 3 allies to level her up is, in my opinion, a pretty big deal. I think that's a sizable buff to her. Whether or not it's enough to make her competitively viable, I don't know. But it's a pretty big deal. The rest of these changes, as I said before, I think they're just kind of setting up the future. Blood for Blood is something that, you know, I want to play around with when the new expansion comes out, just in general, with the Scars decks from what we've seen from Freljord so far. Similarly, you know, Trapper and Starlit Seer, when we get some more proactive support in Freljord, I might mess around with them, but for the most part, I think that this balance patch was setting the stage for our next expansion. So, yeah. Thanks for watching. I know I said that once before, but I'm going to say it again because my thanks is never ending. For those of you who have stuck with me and still watch my content, or if you're new and you're just watching me now because of Runeterra, Either or, I appreciate it. Going from, you know, the Elder Scrolls Legends, where, you know, I was more involved with the community and I had a lot more interaction, and then coming here, it's, you know, it's been a little bit trying at times, but we're getting there, and I'm really excited for this expansion. So I appreciate you all. Thanks. I'm never gonna stop saying it, and hopefully I'll catch you watching future videos.